really sorry I'm not going to be talking about women in the Obama age, although maybe I am actually going to be talking about women in the Obama age, just not very directly. I should tell you also it's a really strange thing being here because there are bright lights shining in my eyes. So if I'm not looking at you, it's not because of you, it's because of the lights. Okay, how's that? Okay, now the only problem is, can I read? Yes. So look, this is not part of my current project. This was a paper that luckily I had on hand because I promise you I didn't write it last night. It's on Irigaray and the Greeks. So let me begin, as I always want to begin, with a quote from Nietzsche. This comes from On the Uses and Liabilities of History for Life. Nietzsche says, "It is only to the extent that I'm a student of more ancient times, above all ancient Greece, that I, as a child of our time, have had such untimely experiences. But I have to concede this much to myself as someone who by occupation is a classical philologist, for I have no idea what the significance of classical philology would be for our age, if not to have an untimely effect, that is, to work against the time, and thereby to have an effect upon it, hopefully for the benefit of a future time." No one ever says it better than Nietzsche. So I want to direct my talk not so much to Irigaray's work, but with her. I want to look at some of the questions to which her work has led me. Without her work, it would not have been possible, at least for me, to understand conceptions of space, time, and becoming as political, social, cultural, and above all as feminist, as well as philosophical and ontological questions. Without her work, it wouldn't have been possible to see that sexual difference is conditioned by and expressed through relations of space, time, and becoming, as much as it is through subjectivity, identity, consciousness, and the unconscious. In other words, Irigaray makes it clear that social, political, and personal relations are always bound up with broader cosmological frameworks that include not only things and objects, including subjects, but also the conditions under which things are made possible: space and time, being and becoming. There is a kind of isomorphism between how we understand our world and how and with what resources we come to understand ourselves. Irigaray provides us with new ways of understanding space and time, not only through their conventional geometrical and physicist representations, but above all in their capacity to change, to be changed, or to engender change. I promise not to speak too long about topology, just for a minute. But topology in its most general sense is the study of the capacity for the transformation and deformation of shapes and spaces, the capacity to bend, fold, and stretch while adhering to certain boundary conditions. So in topology, a shape is less interesting than what can be done with it. In this sense, a circle, a square, and a triangle are considered identical insofar as one can be stretched into another. This explains the topological fascination with knots, holes, toruses, and the Mobius strip, Klein bottles, those objects whose properties change and for whom deformation transforms them from blobs or other shapes with or without holes, or from points and lines. The study of the transformability of shapes and spaces is very closely connected and indeed inseparable from the study of the movements of time, within which shapes are deformed. Time is the condition under which any change or any deformation or reformation occurs, the inherence of movement or becoming in any being. Temporalities, however, are much more difficult objects for scientific or mathematical modelling, insofar as the very notion of a model transforms what occurs in time into a spatial form. Like one can't diagrammatize time. The moment you do, you have space. So if a scientific and quantitative or even a historical study of space and time is possible, that is, if they can be analysed in terms of calculability, steps and minimal units, it's also possible, I'm going to suggest, to have a qualitative analysis of space and time that addresses what is irreducible in each, what is particular about each, and how they remain fundamentally incalculable, and how each in its own way participates in and complicates how we understand both objects and subjects. If we are to devise a more complex and rich understanding of space and time and the beings and becomings that they frame, that emphasises their capacity to be occupied and understood differently, it is no longer adequate to not think about these incorporeals and their conceptualisation. It's no longer adequate for us to leave these concepts like space and time only to the natural sciences, which can provide them with a numerical understanding, but may fail to address the qualities that space and time produce, and that at their best philosophy and art address. The exploration of space and time is the centre of Irigaray's philosophical analysis of sexual difference. Her claim, very broadly, is that only one type of subject, masculine in its privileged European, able-bodied, rational orientation to paternity, is the ideal of the human. And her claim is basically that this one type of subject is the only subject represented through all models of identity, individuality, desire, power, and culture. Even the incorporeal frameworks by which we understand identity, space, time, the cosmos, ideality, dare I even say the word God, are marked by and represent the forms of this unique subject that takes itself for the whole. The conceptual, personal and political transformations that a thoroughgoing recognition of sexual difference involves would entail reconsidering all of our assumptions. I'm going to read you a brief passage from Irigaray that I think many of you will recognise. This comes from An Ethics of Sexual Difference. She says, a revolution in thought and ethics is needed if the work of sexual difference is to take place. We need to reinterpret everything concerning the relations between the subject and discourse, the subject and the world, the subject and the cosmic, the microcosmic and the macrocosmic. In order to think through and live this difference, we must reconsider the whole problematic of space and time. This is a very often quoted passage, and in it, Irigaray makes clear that if the neutrality, replaceability, and normalisation of the knowing subject, of the desiring and speaking subject, is problematised, virtually the whole of ontology remains to be developed. Another ontology, not based on identity and the values and privileging and normalisation that reduces the all to the one, has yet to be developed. This is what Irigaray says. This is the same page, it's page 6 and 7. She says, everything must be rethought, not only in the terms by which we understand space and time, the ontological frameworks, the intervals within which all being and becoming must be located, but also the very concept of identity, insofar as it names and contains all kinds of being, human, natural, cosmological, inhuman, collective. Everything remains to be thought again. Irigaray signals that a new kind of philosophy, indeed a new kind of science and new kinds of art, are required if the one that takes itself for the all is to be scattered into the differences that are hidden in and required for its self-constitution. Let me just quote one more time and fairly briefly. She says, man has been the subject of discourse, whether in theory, morality or politics, and the gender of God, the guardian of every subject and every discourse, is always masculine and paternal. To women are left the so-called minor arts, cooking, knitting, embroidery and sewing, and in exceptional cases, poetry, painting and music. Whatever their importance, these arts do not currently make the rules. at least not overtly. So it is not only the order of the two that Irigaray seeks, because remember that two can always be configured as two ones, as ones that are identical or equivalent to each other. So it's not two that fascinates Irigaray, but the order of heterogeneity, otherness beyond calculability, what cannot be numbered, which is why she uses the phrase at least two. Something that shakes up the very foundations of identity or one. Something that requires the one not contain all in itself. Now, Irigaray's task, among other things, is to demonstrate that the minor arts to which women have been previously restricted beyond philosophy and the sciences, that is, restricted within the order of affect rather than within the order of reason. She suggests that these all need to be re-explored with a view to understanding how women have contributed and what they have produced, even under the constraints of patriarchal domesticity. In other words, she suggests that they've already produced a model of resistance and productivity. But on the other hand, Irigaray's task is also to demonstrate the gaps, holes, the forms of incompletion and limitation that mark the so-called masculine character of philosophy and the sciences, the absences into which feminine, or rather feminist questions can be introduced. Insisting on the at least two, Irigaray foresees a new age of poetry, art and language, the creation of a new poetics. But also, she sees the creation of a new ontology, ethics and politics, which is to say a new kind of philosophy, a new way of thinking. Now, Irigaray has set out the direction or orientation for new modes of knowledge and art creation without specifically developing them herself. I should just note very briefly that Irigaray has published some poetry which I think is bloody awful, but that really isn't particularly relevant to the claim that she's making, that we should direct ourselves to making worlds, which involves making arts and making ourselves. We'll leave her poetry aside for the moment. Irigaray has made it clear that what has represented itself as the incontestable frame or model of artistic, scientific and philosophical production must be challenged, and alternatives, either those abandoned historically or politically, the losers, as it were, of various intellectual disputes, may have more to offer than what has taken over and transformed, ignored or suppressed it in the dominant orders of discourse and practice. In other words, the creation of new kinds of philosophy, science and arts are not enabled merely by critique, by the revelation of the phallocentrism of intellectual institutions and their practices. It is awakened primarily through the untimely calling up of artistic ghosts, remainders of past struggles and sites of resistance that may enable the summoning up of a different future than that which is imminently looming, which is drawn only from the present. Irigaray has understood Nietzsche's lesson for us, not to despise or be rid of any bad historical smells that surround our intellectual and cultural and political heritage, but to make them the source of overcoming, techniques and means by which what is dominant may be overthrown by what it despises and considers most low. It is through a simultaneous subjection of the present to the pasts from which it derives, and the future which lies virtual within it, that a new way of being and becoming, and new ways of living and loving become actualized. And this may be why, as does her marine lover, Nietzsche, Irigaray returns with great insistence and regularity in all of her work to the writings of the Greeks, and particularly the pre-Socratics, those who come before Plato, before Socrates, who, while not exactly representing a pre-patriarchal or pre-phallocentric conceptual order, nevertheless remain much closer to an acknowledgement of sexual difference and the place of goddesses in the pantheon that constitutes the universe and its regulative principles. The Greeks enable Irigaray to remain untimely, not quite of her own time, to invoke what is left out of the rise of modern philosophy and modern sciences and arts. Her return to the pre-Socratics is central to her attempts to restore a more direct and natural connection between the sexes, as well as a more direct and natural connection between bodies and ideas, or materiality and ideality, which have been severed from each other with the rise of Western philosophy, and particularly with the rise of Platonism and Aristotelianism. Irigaray's interest in the early Greeks is not accidental. Neither, of course, is Nietzsche's. For both, their goal, and particularly Irigaray's goal, throughout her writings, remains very close to the Greeks and to the greatest readers of the Greeks, which are probably, I say nervously, Nietzsche and Heidegger, insofar as they retain something of the Greeks, each of them. Her goal is to restore to philosophy its role as a combined or not differentiatable physics, ethics, aesthetics, and ontology. The restoration of philosophy as that which talks of the real. And in doing this, she wants to show the paradoxical unity or immanence of difference before the concept of identity has overtaken and transformed difference into opposition or contradiction. This is a task Irigaray shares with a number of male philosophers. Many of them are long ago. Very few of them are actually present. Not only the pre-Socratics, but the Stoics and the Epicureans, that is, the post-Aristotelians, as well as Spinoza, Nietzsche, and even Deleuze, who have taken as their project the restoration of the continuities of the real and the return of respect not only to the materiality of things, including living things, but also to their incorporeal conditions, to the framing conditions under which space, time, and sense or representability give possible order to the world of things. This task places her firmly in the history of an alternative philosophy to the dominant order. The dominant order in philosophy we can name by a few key star names: Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Hegel. What is interesting about her work is her very self-conscious effort to show the conditions under which each of these philosophies is possible and what they suppress in their own self-elevation. And this fascination, of course, places her within much of contemporary French philosophy, which has tended to seek immanence rather than transcendence as the mode most adequate to address difference in itself. But Irigaray doesn't directly undertake this task. At best, and this is what's annoying about her, she provides hints, perplexing suggestions, but she herself doesn't really elaborate a new ontology of sexual difference, an ontology that, insofar as it addresses real problems, shares a natural affinity with all other forms of knowledge, that is, with the sciences and the arts, which each address, in their own way, the same orders of the real as philosophy. Irigaray has turned her writings away from the discipline and institution of philosophy to speak more directly and in quite different terms about political and cultural questions necessary for the personal cultivation of sexual difference. This is why it is necessary, for me at least, to move beyond her own texts and to perhaps return to some extent to some of her earlier writings on ontology and sexual ethics, to develop some of the striking claims that she articulated in the beginning but doesn't really return to in her current phase of writing. She's also, by the way, extremely prolific, and there are 3 more books that are in the publication pipeline that we have to wait for. Still, I think it's worth exploring, at least in a preliminary way, the ontoethics and the ontoaesthetics that her work enables, a rethinking of space, time, things, and especially the debts of the relations of debt obligation, enhancement, and creation that life generates from the world of things and the incorporeal forces that orient and give sense to the world of things. Such a project must draw together, as Irigaray does, the ontological forces of the real world of material and immaterial forces, the living elaborations of these forces, and the struggle at the level of human existence for the right to define, know, and order this whole, a political, ethical, and cultural regulation that orders individuals according to regimes that benefit only one type of individual. It involves not only understanding the constitution of identity and individuality, which may be understood as pre-individual forces that make possible any form of identity. It may also involve the creation of grids of opposition to regulate and control these forms, and the forces of power that both enforce and resist these imposed orders. And I think it's because contemporary social life, and especially in feminist terms, is so dense and so complicated, that Irigaray often seeks a point outside or before the full emergence of the forces of identity and individuality. She seeks for an infinite and unbounded principle of openness, and it's interesting that she has to go back to the very origin of philosophy to find such sources. I'm just going to mention one name for a moment, a name that probably most of us don't know but should, Anaximander. And I'll read you a little bit about what she says about him. She's suggesting that we need a principle, and this is her claim from the book Ecstasy, from the collection, I think it's called Teachings, where it's called The Ecstasy Between Us. She says, the closure of the world and of individuals upon themselves is due to a fear of the opening, of that which remains without limits, boundless, and is assimilated to emptiness or chaos. It corresponds in a way to that which the Greek philosophers designate as the apeiron, that's A-P-E-R-I-R-O-N, the apeiron, and tried to exclude from their world. The world, like the logos and the speaking being, thus became enclosed and cut off from a living becoming because of a desire for mastery and a fear of opening, because of a need for mastery which results from a fear of opening. Now, Anaximander is one of the pre-Socratics. He lived 610 to 546 BC, and he's one of the pre-Socratics. He develops a notion of the apeiron as the infinite original principle of being that cannot be identified with any particular being, but only with every being, with all of being considered together. A one which is not one, which is the universe itself, which Christianity called God. The apeiron in Anaximander is a kind of maternal or feminine principle that gives birth to all that exists or could come into being. It is both an indefinite and limitless temporal horizon. We today would call it eternity. And it is an indefinite and boundless space that is both the origin and destination of all that is and could be. This is what today is called the universe that is produced as the result of the Big Bang. So Anaximander asks a question that the Big Bang theorists have only been able to direct themselves to in the last 10 years. Where does the Big Bang come from? Okay, where does it come from? What point of origin does the universe have from which it comes and to which it tends again? It's only in the last 10 years that cosmologists have begun to believe that perhaps there's not just one universe, but infinite numbers of universes. And this is basically the theory of the inflationary universe that is currently on trend. What is striking about the work of some of the ancient Greeks is how remarkably modern they are. So the apeiron is the source of worlds and that to which worlds or the cosmos return when they're destroyed, as well as that from which the cosmos are generated when they are renewed. So the Greeks are asking the question of eternity and the origin of matter. How does matter come into being? How does it regulate itself? What happens to it when it disappears? These are remarkably postmodern questions from this pre-modern moment. Plato wants to provide a limit to this openness of the universe. He delimits it by inventing a concept that he calls the chora. And the chora is a passage or a transition from the abstractness of this pure universe into real things. The chora, some people have called it the womb of existence, because Plato has to invoke a concept that is incredibly about giving birth. Like, how do pure ideas give birth to real objects? Plato can't really explain. But in the works of the Greeks, especially the Stoics, it is the fiery breath of pneuma that is the condition for the eruption of universes, and is the final destination of universes, a fiery conflagration or apocalypse. It's a word I never thought I'd say. A fiery apocalypse. In many ways, this is the earliest anticipation of contemporary cosmology's fascination with the origin of the universe. And it's not altogether strange that Irigaray invokes Anaximander, along with Empedocles, in her attempt to restore the forces that resist human and masculine order, forces that regulate the very existence of things, including living things, whose considerations remain outside the concern of contemporary cosmology. Like Nietzsche, it is only the Greeks who enable her to remain untimely, out of her time, not quite modern, nor properly postmodern, for they have not established properly disciplinary boundaries between knowledge yet, the pre-Socratics. They haven't distinguished physics, logic, ethics from philosophy. And the pre-Socratics still affirm the interconnectedness of the fate of individuals and civilizations with the orders of the universe, something that, by the way, it would be good for us to be reminded of occasionally. The Greeks still remain attentive to the relations between us. This is what Irigaray is interested in cultivating, the relation between us, a relation itself as much as the things related to. Like Nietzsche, Irigaray remains contemporary only to the extent that she works on anachronisms. She remains relevant only to the degree that she reminds us of what we have forgotten that still persists, the ghosts of concepts that remain as yet undigested, concepts that affirm this world, that affirm life, that affirm chance, and that indeed affirm affirmation itself, which is to say that affirm difference. Why must this affirmation involve philosophy? This is a question I ask myself every day. That is, why must it involve the creation of concepts and the forms of argument that surround them? Unlike Irigaray, who I think has left philosophy largely behind, I believe that philosophy is crucial to the project of an absolute affirmation. It is not merely a personal, cultural, and social relation that needs to be created, affirmed, and explored. For every such relation is embedded in an entire world. And as Irigaray acknowledges, each living being brings a world with it. The relations which constitute us and our social and personal connections are ontological as much as and before they are cultural. They are what we think and how we think. Before there are individuals, things, beings, forms of consciousness and human relation, there are real forces, real actions, real histories and geographies, forms and direction of sense that make individuals possible and that constitute their conditions of flourishing. I'm going to say it aloud and proud. There is a pre-individual real. These are the forces, yes, these are the forces that pre-exist any and all individuals, the forces that make life and things in all their differences possible. If Irigaray remains profoundly attached to the Greeks, and especially the pre-Socratics, it's because they understood, at the very birth of philosophy, that philosophy is directed to questions of how to live well, how to understand the resources we have and the capacity we have to use them to enhance life and things through concepts, through ideas. Otherwise, they're a complete waste of time. We're all in a field where ideas count as much as material things because they frame and give value to material things. So at its inception, philosophy is suffused with a physics of existence, an ontology which attempts to explain the orders of physics. But also, interestingly, at its beginning, philosophy is tinged with ethics. Physics and ethics are not separate for the Greeks. And this is an ethics that can't be reduced to a morality, i.e. what we should all do, but an ethics that addresses the question, how to live well within the world, how to create through aesthetics things that produce a well-ordered and joyous life for ourselves. Ontology is the order which attempts to understand the connection between the causal orders that make up the world, physics. Ontology is also linked to the realm of freedom, which is the sphere of ethics and politics. But above all, it's linked to the means and modes of creation, which links it directly to art, culture, social and religious relations. These are the relations of necessity and freedom that make human life and all forms of life possible. The advent of concepts, the birth of philosophy, is the condition under which a life lives in the joy of freedom that reason, or maybe I should say reason in its many modalities, provides thought as a mode of freedom from the necessities of the real. Such a life, even for the early Greeks, is rare and exemplary. A life lived in accordance with the dictates of thought, not in opposition to the passions, but in full acknowledgement of them and for their capacity for moderation. A reasoned life, one lived according to the dictates of a philosophy that aims to adequately address the complexities of the world, is a life that is both aware of itself, aware of others in their radical otherness, and the right of the other to have its other, but also aware of the creative potential of life in its engagement with things. A philosophical frame provides a means to elaborate for oneself an ethics of living well and an aesthetics of creation, both self-creation and the production of art. A philosophical life enables a physics, an ethics, and an aesthetics to regulate the actions of the subject and the social collective self-reflexively. I won't raise the current presidential campaign, which is the antithesis of everything that the Greeks conceptualized as possible. Irigaray seeks a restoration of this fundamental unity. I've called it a unity, but could just as easily be understood as pure difference. This pure difference in which concepts, philosophical methods, the structures of dichotomization and binarization that come to order and regulate thought through patriarchal logic, it comes at a moment before these are fully formed, although logic and binarization do emerge at exactly the time of these earliest texts. We nevertheless need to understand the virtualities that such an early Greek concept offers us in the present. A new way to think, new kind of theory, one so anachronistic, so buried in our past, that it has never properly decayed and disappeared for us, but remains to haunt patriarchal thought with its possibilities for being otherwise, and with patriarchy's own earliest intellectual steps. A way of thinking of life adequate to sexual difference and its place in the generation of the differences that mark all human variation may find, ironically, that its most contemporary expression lies in the most ancient texts of Western civilization and the ballast of potential that these texts leave for us even today. With the work of the pre-Socratics, we find the liveliness of every part of the universe, the fundamental connection of all things, their coexistence and equal value for the gods and goddesses. And in the work of the later Greeks, the Stoics and the Epicureans, we see the desire to lead a life of clarity, simplicity and health that affirms the fate of both ourselves, which is to say what is very small, and the vastness and interconnectedness of the universe as a whole. The Greeks aimed to be worthy of their fate, to be worthy of what happens to them, of what becomes to them, and they aim to prepare themselves through the elaboration of thought and the practices that best facilitate this for such a fate that cannot be controlled but can be prepared for. For me, though, perhaps the most interesting thing about the Greeks, and particularly the Stoics, is not only that philosophy is an ethics and an aesthetics of existence, a manner of living in accordance with nature, but also their refusal to distinguish between matter and idea, matter and ideality, the acknowledgement that the reality of ideas and their irreducibility to things alone is an important commitment. Ideas are real. If philosophy is an ethics and an aesthetics of existence, then thought must be part of the reality of things, one of their components, or better, the framing of things by sense, by space, by time, by the void, by incorporeals. I'm just going to have a couple of minutes on the incorporeal and then I'm going to finish. We may all be finished by then. The incorporeal is that which subsists within matter without existing as such. Okay, it's a really interesting idea. The Stoics invented this concept. It's the condition of materiality and the excess of materiality. The incorporeal is the capacity of the material to express, represent, and have propositions made about it. The incorporeal is the inherence of the ideal on the impact of material things. It's the event which coheres things, at least momentarily, and provides things with their possibilities of being expressed or spoken. Although Irigaray doesn't discuss this in any depth in her writings, as far as I'm aware, the relations between sense and materiality, especially lived sexed bodies, is, I think, at the centre of Irigaray's work. And I don't think it would be too much of an imposition on Irigaray's work to suggest that the ancient refiguring of the mind-body material ideal relation is of immense value in Irigaray's rethinking of sexual difference. So how to think difference outside the constraints of identity or one is a thought that occurs in Western philosophy only with great rarity. I'm going to mention 3 or 4 names, but they're very old. Socrates, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Spinoza, Nietzsche. There are a few others. It's only by activating what in these anachronistic texts, what hasn't been subsumed under the one of identity and hasn't been adequately thought about life, matter, and their relations, that allows us to return to these figures and find something new in them. What all of them share, despite their differences, is a resistance to any simple-minded or reductive materialism, even though all the people I've named are materialists. What each of them has attempted to do is resist the reduction of the reality of ideas to their material expression. Each of them affirms the reality and the power of concepts and of thinking. Let me just say that thinking needs to be opposed to beliefs and opinions. Okay, thinking is not the production of opinions. We emote opinions. We actually have to produce ideas. They're hard. Bergson said that in one's lifetime, one is lucky to have one idea, one concept. So each of these theorists attempt to think ideality as a manner of orienting and organising things that is not reducible to things, but is the condition under which they become things. We are spatial and temporal beings, and we can conceptualise our topological and temporal relations only through these incorporeal forms. It's only because the material world has an inner orientation. It's only because materiality is directed by infinity and in eternity that we are beings who can generate meaning and sense. We are beings who can make order of the world. And by we, I mean any being at all that is a being. The world of sense surrounds and it suffuses the world of things, making the world of things knowable, speakable, and transformable. And it is the history of this knowledge that Irigaray's writings urge us to return to and rethink in order to restore to thought its power to direct life into living well. Such a reading of philosophy as a mode of health, well-being, and artistic creation, is indeed Irigaray's vision for a future adequate to the recognition of sexual difference. From Sexes and Genealogy, she says, "Nature has a sex, always and everywhere. All traditions that remain faithful to the cosmic order have a sex and take account of natural powers in sexual terms. They are also regulated by alternations that do not truly contradict each other." Irigaray here is talking about a world, a cosmic order that is acknowledged as sexually different, peoples that make the cultivation of their difference the condition of philosophy, culture, and social and artistic life, that reflect and are the products of such differences. But such people can only be brought into existence through the wrenching of the current orders of patriarchy, democracy, multiculturalism, and globalisation, the wrenching of them out of their present trajectories through a dose of the untimely. Difference is that which cannot be objectified, that which does not consist in a relation between two independent, autonomous, and self-defined things, individuals. Difference is the imperceptible, perhaps even incorporeal order that nevertheless constitutes the possibility of any differences within nature and between nature and culture. As ontological foundation, as an existing force that remains imperceptible, difference constitutes both the conditions for and the inevitable undoing of all identities beyond their fleeting appearance. As imperceptible as the void, as formless as space within which all forms are experimented with and rotated, as incorporeal as time, and as bound up directly with the expression of sense, and thus with art, literature, philosophy, and science. Difference is the very condition of the emergence of the contingencies of the world. Difference is the impossibility of any being remaining itself. Difference is the requirement that each thing become other than itself. A world of difference is made up of many worlds, populated by others with whom we share varying degrees of sameness, others who are both human and inhuman. Irigaray considers such a world of difference as divine. I prefer to think of it as real, the orders of materiality and ideality through which difference expresses itself. Thank you.